It's still dark outside. The air smells like smoke and frozen earth. Inside the longhouse, embers from last night's fire pulse gently in the hearth, casting a faint orange glow on thick wooden beams. A sleepy murmur passes between the family. As they rise with the cold light, the baby coughs. A dog shifts on the dirt floor. Someone sneezes. Then scrape, clatter. The iron pot is lifted back over the coals. This is not the lavish Viking banquet sung about in sagas. It's breakfast. And it's humble. You probably wouldn't last a week on what the Vikings ate every morning. There were no cinnamon buns, no bacon sizzling, no coffee. Most days, their first meal was barley porridge or a crumbly bread with curdled milk. Nutritional? Barely. Filling? Hopefully. Tasty? That was negotiable, but despite the simplicity, this was a sacred rhythm. This morning meal marked the official beginning of the Viking day. And if you were lucky, it came with a drizzle of honey or dried fruit. If not, just chew and be grateful. That's how they survived the brutal North. And before you get too comfortable in this longhouse, subscribe to the video sharing channel. This journey into Viking kitchens is just heating up. Now, the first fingers of sunlight touch the frost-covered thatch outside. The oldest daughter stirs the pot. It's barley again. She sighs. Another day, another chew. They called it dagvirth, the day meal. It was typically eaten early, not long after waking, though early in Viking terms depended entirely on the season. In winter, that might mean a sunless 10 a.m. In summer, it was closer to 4 or 5. They followed the light. Barley porridge was the star of the table, often boiled with water or skim milk from the previous day's milking. Sometimes they added bits of dried apples or herbs for flavor. When the cow was generous or the goats especially active, there might even be a pat of soft cheese or spoon of thick, yellow cream. Breakfast was a communal thing. Not everyone sat at a table. The table, after all, was often a single long board, pulled out from the wall or even just knees and laps. But everyone shared. The elders stirred the pot. The children begged for the crispy grain stuck to the side. The mother pinched off a bit of yesterday's bread, dipped it in milk, and handed it to the baby. There was no such thing as idle eating. Every meal served a purpose: fuel to work, to walk, to weave or fight or fish. A Viking didn't eat for comfort. They ate to live. Yet within this rugged reality, there was tenderness, a shared spoon, a wink from a father to his hungry son, a laugh when someone found a burnt hazelnut hidden in the bottom of the bowl. Now and then, breakfast came with a joke. One old tale told of a woman who tricked her brother into thinking the porridge had meat by placing a small bone under his spoon. He bit hard, broke a tooth. They laughed about it for years, but not every morning was light-hearted. If the stores were low, if the winter had been hard or trade hadn't gone well, breakfast could be grim. Bark bread, yes, made from powdered birch bark might be passed around, or a thin broth made from boiling bones a third, fourth, or fifth time. And still, everyone ate in silence, heads bowed not in prayer, but in focus. Every crumb mattered. Historians still debate whether Vikings had formal meal times or simply ate when food was available. Some say they followed a predictable rhythm. Others argue their meals were dictated more by season and circumstance. After all, in the summer months, when fishing and farming were at their peak, Meals were often quick and outdoors. In winter, everything moved indoors and slowed down. The longhouse hearth became the kitchen, dining room, and center of life. One of the odder facts about Viking breakfast: they sometimes drank beer with it. Not the heavy, hoppy kind you might know today, but a weak ale barely alcoholic called Ver. Children even drank it. Safer than water, which could carry disease. It warmed the belly and, oddly enough, complemented the porridge. By the time the bowls were empty, chores had already begun. Someone carried out the slop for the pigs. Someone else cleaned the pot. One child fetched water. Another tended the fire. The morning was already in full swing, and as the family moved into the day, that first simple meal lingered, not because it was delicious, but because it was necessary. It had done its job. The sun climbed higher. The smoke from the hearth curled into the sky. The barley pot was rinsed and set aside. Another Viking day had begun. The sun is higher now, casting sharp shadows through the smoke hole above the hearth. Outside, the cold clings stubbornly to the ground, but inside, the longhouse bustles. Someone lifts a wooden lid beneath it in a shallow pit lined with hay. And stones lies a cache of smoked fish. It's stiff with salt, blackened at the edges, still edible. Still precious. In a world without fridges, food storage wasn't just clever, it was the difference between life and starvation, and the Vikings were very, very clever. You might think they just hunted and ate what they killed that day. But no, a single mistake in storing food could spoil the winter. Imagine going through 3 snowbound months with nothing but spoiled butter and moldy onions. You'd get creative or get sick. Maybe both. So how did they do it? Salt, smoke, fermentation, drying, burying. That's how the Viking pantry stayed stocked through the leanest seasons. It wasn't pretty, but it worked, and it was a science of its own. Start with meat. Once slaughtered, typically in late autumn when feed was low and animals couldn't be supported through the winter, the meat was either smoked or salted. In coastal areas, they packed fish and beef into wooden barrels layered with salt. Inland, where salt was expensive, smoking took over. Longhouses often had a second room dedicated to smoke curing, where meat would hang above a constantly smoldering fire for days or weeks, soaking up flavor and preservation power. Ever smelled a longhouse full of drying cod? Let's just say you'd remember it. In fact, the smell was so distinct that traders from the south sometimes described Norse ships by the scent alone. Smoke, tar, and dried fish. Hard to miss. The oddest preservation method: fermented shark. Yes, some coastal communities would bury Greenland shark meat in the sand and leave it to rot, then dry it out for later eating. The result? A dish so pungent, even modern Icelanders struggle to swallow it. But back then, it was survival. Grains posed a different problem. Stored improperly, they attracted mice, moisture, or mold. So, Viking women developed layered storage grain, placed in sealed barrels, sometimes packed with ash or kept in lofts away from the damp ground. The ash trick kept insects out and reduced spoilage. It sounds odd, but it worked. And if you were lucky, your grain could last from one harvest to 2. The next. Historians still debate whether Viking granaries were communal or personal. Some sites suggest shared food storage pits, while others point to private stores managed by individual households. Both likely existed, depending on the size of the settlement and the season. Dairy, of course, didn't keep well. Butter and cheese helped solve that. Butter was churned and packed into clay jars, sometimes buried in bogs to keep cool. The bog acted like a refrigerator minus the electricity. And those cheeses? Hard, salty, tangy. Not brie, more like a block of determination. Fruits. And vegetables? Dried or pickled. Apples were sliced and laid in the sun, while berries were boiled into thick preserves or fermented into weak wines. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots were stored in earth cellars, kept moist enough to stay edible for months. And let's not forget one unsung hero, lard. Rendered animal fat, stored in jars, could be used to preserve cooked meats. Layer it over a pot of stewed pork, let it cool, and the solidified fat sealed in the freshness. Vikings might not have known the word anaerobic, but they understood it intuitively. Now, let's visit a small village before winter. Families gather around barrels and crates. Smoked herring is hung in bundles, eel is strung like beads. Onions and garlic are braided and hung from beams to dry. Children carry small baskets of berries to their mothers, who stew them into thick, tarry syrup that can last all winter. And there's always one family not yours, of course, that lets the meat go too long before salting. The smell gives them away. By January, they'll be bartering for dried peas and regretting everything. Still, accidents happened. Mice got into barley stores. Molds crept into the butter. One old saga tells of a winter where the beer went sour and the bread sprouted green. Fur. The household blamed a mischievous Landvedera, spirit of the earth. More likely, it was just poor sealing and a crack in the roof. A bit of vinegar might have saved it. But vinegar was precious too, often brewed from old mead or wine and saved for pickling. One humorous tradition? Viking children were sometimes sent into the grain store with whistles. The high-pitched noise scared rats, or so they claimed. Whether it worked or not, it gave the adults a break from both the rodents and the racket. You can almost hear the sound, a shrill whistle echoing through a barn. While mice scatter and the boy laughs at nothing in particular. Of course, storage wasn't only about food. Herbs were hung to dry, both for cooking and healing. Wild thyme, juniper, angelica all gathered and tied in neat bundles, their scent mixing with the smell of smoked lamb and stale ale. A Viking pantry wasn't just a place, it was a living, breathing archive of survival. And when midwinter came and the snow piled high, the family would gather around the fire, open a well-sealed barrel of dried apples, and share them slowly. Piece by precious piece, even in the harshest cold, the memory of sunlit harvests lingered. Because the Vikings didn't just store food, they stored hope. The morning passes, and outside, the soft thump of wooden shoes treads across frozen earth. Inside the longhouse, there's a familiar rhythm. Scrape, grind, scrape, grind. In the corner, beside the door, a woman bends over a quernstone, a simple pair of rough, circular stones stacked like a thick sandwich. Between them, barley is slowly, painfully crushed into flour. If you've ever complained about making toast in the morning, this would break you, because before the Vikings could eat bread, they had to make the flour. And that meant hours, literally hours of grinding grains by hand, a chore as essential as it was exhausting. But the bread? Oh, it was everything. Not the fluffy, yeasty kind you picture with butter and jam. Viking bread was flat, dark, coarse somewhere, between a cracker and a hockey puck. And still, it was the backbone of the Norse diet. You'd smell it first, a hint of sour, a trace of burnt grain. Then the sound wooden paddles slapping dough onto hot stones or even straight onto the hearths. Edge. Some households had a primitive oven, a dome of clay that held in heat just long enough to cook a few loaves before crumbling apart again. And the flavor? Let's just say chewing was half the meal. Barley, rye, and sometimes oats formed the base. Wheat was rare and precious, mostly imported and saved for feasts or sacred rituals. Even barley wasn't always pure. In hard years, the flour was stretched with ground-up bark, seeds, or oddly enough crushed bones. That added calcium. Also crunch. Historians still debate whether bone flour was a famine invention or a widespread practice. Some say it was only used in extreme shortages. Others argue it was routine, especially among inland communities where fishing and dairy were scarce. Either way, it wasn't wasted, and no Viking household functioned without the quernstone. It was usually operated by women or older children kneeling beside it, turning the upper stone in slow, endless circles. Dust clung to their sleeves, their hands blistered. But without this humble tool, there would be no bread, no porridge, no dumplings or gruel. Just raw grain and empty stomachs. There's even a story, half funny, half sad, of a girl so bored of grinding that she pretended to faint just to skip her shift. Her mother gave her extra turns the next day. A lesson well learned. Some longhouses had more advanced rotary querns, where a wooden handle made the grinding slightly less torturous. But the noise remained the same, a low, constant scrape that vibrated through the walls. It was the soundtrack of Viking kitchens. Once the flour was ready, it was mixed with water, maybe a little leftover whey or sour milk, kneaded roughly and flattened into rounds. No rising time, no yeast. Just slap it down, heat the stones, and hope for a good char without burning the middle dot in summer. These breads might be cooked outdoors, near the field where others were threshing the barley. In winter, the hearth did double duty, warming the family and cooking the food. Occasionally, the bread included herbs, crushed wild garlic, stinging nettle. Yes, really. It's edible when cooked, or even fennel for flavor. These additions weren't just tasty, they were medicinal. Bread was so essential that some households used it as edible plates. Lay a stew atop a flat round of barley bread, let the juices soak in, then tear off pieces to eat. Nothing wasted, no dishes. Just full bellies. You'll find humor here too. One popular joke among traders was about travelers' bread, a type so dense that it could double as a weapon. Supposedly, a Viking once knocked out a rival by throwing a loaf at his head. True. Probably not. Memorable? Absolutely. Another curious practice involved bread offerings. Before planting in spring, some villages buried a piece of last year's bread beneath the field, asking for a bountiful harvest. Not religious, exactly, more like tradition wrapped in superstition. A seed of faith in edible form. Bread even appeared in marriage rituals. During weddings, the couple shared a loaf, breaking it together as a sign of unity. Whoever got the bigger half. Folklore said they'd be the household head. Conveniently, the bride's mother often baked an extra soft loaf just for this moment. By midday, bread reappeared in almost every meal. With soup, with salted fish, dipped in butter or dunked in ale. Even when cold and tough, it was still eaten. Waste not, want not, and when travelers arrived, the first thing offered was often bread and ale. It said, "You are welcome, you are safe, and you'll be fed." For all its plainness, Viking bread told stories of labor, of tradition, of survival. Every loaf was a timeline planted, harvested, ground, baked, and eaten, all by the same hands. And as the day wore on and another batch was set on the hearth, the longhouse once again filled with that sharp, earthy smell. Smoke, grain, fire. The smell of old worlds and full stomachs. The noonlight filters in, softer now, bouncing off wooden beams blackened with time and smoke. A horn cup clinks quietly. There's a soft squelch as curds are spooned from a leather pouch. A sheep bleats in the distance. It's time for dairy another. Quiet but vital pillar of the Viking diet. If the bread was the body of a meal, dairy was the soul. From milk to butter, cheese to sour whey, it flowed through every kitchen, every meal, every day. And unlike meat, which was often saved for special occasions, dairy was expected, needed, normal. You might not last long drinking what they did. Viking milk didn't come chilled from glass bottles. It came warm, direct, and sometimes lumpy. But oh, it was valuable. Cows and goats were the unsung heroes of Norse survival. Each morning, the animals were led from their stalls and milked by hand into wooden buckets. The milk was then poured into skin sacks or clay pots. The cream rose to the top, the rest used fast or it soured. That was intentional. Sour milk wasn't failure, it was opportunity. From that tangy liquid, Vikings created soft cheese, butter, curd, and even fermented drinks. Nothing wasted. If it could be stirred, churned, or strained, it was food. Churning butter was a daily ritual. Inside a tall wooden barrel, cream was sloshed back and forth for what felt like forever until the magic happened. Suddenly, the liquid thickened. A ball of pale, golden butter appeared, floating in buttermilk. Children often did the churning. Sometimes with songs, sometimes with groans. There's even an old joke about a boy who pretended the butter churn was a drum until he splashed buttermilk across the wall and got extra chores for his musical career. Butter was precious, salted to last longer, then packed into small tubs. It was used to flavor bread, seal jars, or barter in market stalls. In lean times, a smear of butter could transform dry barley into a meal worth savoring. Then there was cheese. Soft cheese, mostly tangy, creamy, and short-lived. It had to be eaten within days unless dried into hard rounds. Some Viking households made whey cheese, similar to modern ricotta. It wasn't glamorous, but it filled bellies. Historians still debate whether Viking cheese was deliberately aged or simply allowed to survive as long as possible. There's little evidence of structured aging like today, but some burial sites suggest hard cheeses were stored as provisions for the afterlife. Imagine packing cheese for eternity. You'd want it firm, the oddest dairy product. A sour, fermented drink called surmilk, something like yogurt's unpredictable cousin. Left in skin bags for days, it bubbled, curdled, and occasionally fizzed. Some loved it. Others held their noses. Everyone drank it. And here's a strange twist: animal stomachs were sometimes used to help cheese curdle. Rennet, a natural enzyme, made the milk firm. Yes, they understood that, even if they didn't call it biochemistry. They called it craft. Dairy also played a role in religion and ritual. On certain feast days, women poured milk onto the earth to honor Jair, the earth goddess. Others offered butter to hearth spirits or smeared it on doorposts for protection during storms. A midwinter custom involved making a special butter-rich porridge, only eaten by the head of the household. It was thick, hot, and heavy with cream, symbolic of warmth and prosperity in the coldest time of year. Of course, dairy wasn't always romantic. Milk spoiled fast, especially in summer. Curdled too far, it became inedible or nearly so. In desperation, some families made sour cakes from the thickest parts, drying them into hard discs and sucking on them during long travels. Not delicious. But survival rarely is, and cows themselves were more than just milk machines. A single cow was a sign of wealth, a walking pantry. Goats, though smaller, were easier to manage and often preferred by poorer households. Their milk was stronger, too more pungent, with a sharp edge that reminded people it came from an animal, not a shelf. One recorded tale speaks of a goat so ornery that it kicked over 3 butter churns in 1 week, earning the nickname Stormhoof. The name stuck, so did the bruises. Dairy was everywhere. It softened harsh bread. It thickened soups. It sweetened the otherwise sour life of hard-working people. And in homes where meat was rare and vegetables were few, it provided fat, calcium, and calories in 1 creamy spoonful. By afternoon, the dairy work was done, the butter stored. The curds hung in linen to drip. A child licked a wooden spoon when no one was looking. Outside, cows grazed quietly, unaware of their daily contributions. Inside, a shallow bowl of cheese and barley sat waiting. No garnish, no fanfare. Just nourishment, reliable, steady, and deeply Viking. Salt clings to the air like dust. A rope creaks as it's hauled over the side of a small wooden boat. Below, the sea slaps rhythmically against the hull. Far from the longhouse and hearth, another kind of meal is being pulled from the deep. Silver flashes herring, cod, maybe a wriggling eel. The Vikings weren't just farmers, they were fishers, and the sea fed them just as often as the land. For coastal communities, daily meals began and ended with the ocean. Fishing wasn't a hobby, it was survival, profession, and sometimes punishment all rolled into one. Children were taught young, tossing nets or baiting hand lines, balancing barefoot on slippery decks. Salt stung their faces. Wind slapped their cheeks. But every fish they hauled up was one less mouth to worry about. And yet, oddly, fish was not always held in the highest regard. While meat from land animals was considered rich and special, fish was routine. The workhorse of the Viking table. Always there, often taken for granted. Still, without it, people went hungry. Cod and herring were staples, especially in the north. In rivers and fjords, they caught salmon, trout, even freshwater perch. The most curious catch? Lamprey eel-like. Jawless creatures that looked like they belonged in nightmares. But to Vikings, they were delicacies, grilled over open flame or preserved in brine. Fish preservation was an art. Salt drying and smoking kept fish edible for months. Stockfish, air-dried cod hammered flat and tough as wood could be. Eaten as is or boiled into stews. It traveled well and often appeared in the provisions of raiders and traders alike. Historians still debate how far Viking fishing practices extended. Some argue they fished only near shorelines. Others claim evidence of deep-sea techniques, long lines, multiple hooks, and nets that stretched for meters. What's certain is they knew their water. And they knew its moods. One stormy afternoon, so the story goes, a boy fell overboard while pulling in a net. He surfaced not with fish, but a sea urchin stuck to his lip. The family laughed about it for weeks. The boy, less so. But the sea wasn't only a supplier, it was a table too. Along rocky coastlines, seaweed was collected and dried. Not the sushi kind, thicker, saltier, chewier. But it added flavor to broths and served as a roughage filler in times of need. Mussels and clams were gathered from tide pools, often roasted with herbs or boiled in iron pots. Even seabird eggs, speckled and strange, were taken from cliffs and cooked slowly, sometimes scrambled with cheese if luck allowed. And the guts? Oh, they didn't go to waste. Fish heads were boiled into thin soup. Livers were fried in fat or rendered for oil. In poorer homes, nothing, absolutely nothing, was thrown away. A Viking wife could stretch one salted cod into 3 meals and a candle, if needed. One unusual delicacy involved stuffing a gutted fish with herbs, onions, and fermented milk, then roasting it slowly near the edge of the fire. The smell was, let's say, an acquired taste. But guests were expected to compliment it. Tradition required at least one exaggerated nod of approval before swallowing, and yes, there were jokes even here. A sailor once claimed he could tell which port he was in just by the taste of the fish soup. In one town, it was so salty it could cure meat. In another, so watery it might have been flavored rain. Some families specialized in fishing. They traded excess for barley or cheese inland. These traders were welcome visitors, part newsbearer, part provision provider. They came with baskets of dried eel and jugs of brine. And always, always stories. There's even a tale of a traveling fishmonger who claimed he once caught a trout big enough to eat a duck mid-flight. No one believed him. But he got free beer that night just for the entertainment. In settlements built beside fjords, smokehouses stood near the shore, their roofs stained with decades of brine and herring oil. Inside, rows of fish hung like wind chimes, drying slowly. Above alderwood fires, the smell was overwhelming. But to a Viking, that was the scent of winter security. And children played nearby, flicking fish bones like darts or pretending dried tails were swords. Food and fun, side by side. By late afternoon, the catch would be sorted. Fresh fish went to the hearth. The rest packed in salt or hung to dry. A wife might stew cod with turnips or grill it on a flat stone. Some days, only soup. Other days, a rare luxury fried herring in goat fat, crusted with herbs. When the sun dipped low, the men came in from the water, their arms heavy, their stomachs hungrier. And there, in the glow of the fire, was the meal they'd earned. Not glorious, not grand, but sustaining. Fish, flatbread, and a spoonful of seaweed soup. They ate in silence, tired and grateful, because the ocean didn't just offer food, it demanded respect. And every meal from its depths reminded the Vikings of their place, small, weather-beaten, but never without hope. The sky turns golden, and the long house flickers with the last firelight of the day. Tonight is different. There's a pulse in the air. Neighbors arrive, cloaks brushed with snow. Someone carries a goat leg wrapped in birch bark. Another brings a bundle of leeks, their roots still damp with frost. The long wooden table is scrubbed. The benches are pulled close. A feast is coming, but don't be misled. Viking feasts weren't everyday affairs. Most days were modest: gruel, bread, maybe dried fish, a warm stew if the gods smiled. But when the stars aligned after a raid, during a wedding, or at the turn of the seasons, they celebrated. And when they celebrated, they feasted like kings. You probably wouldn't survive a Viking feast. Not because the food would kill you, but because you'd never keep up. Multiple courses. Jokes yelled across. Tables, skulls raised high, children running underfoot. Someone playing a bone flute in the corner. It was chaos. Glorious smoky chaos. Feast meat was rare and special. Cattle were expensive to raise and keep. Pigs were easier, and their meat more common at celebrations. Sheep, goats, and the occasional hunted deer or elk filled the rest. One odd tradition even featured horse meat ritually slaughtered and roasted. Historians still debate whether this was a religious rite or just a practical use of old animals. Likely both. In any case, it wasn't eaten casually. Tonight, though, it's pork. The host bastes it with a glaze of honey and beer, turning the spit slowly over an open fire. The smell lingers in the rafters, sweet, smoky, primal. Vegetables play a quiet supporting role. Boiled turnips, roasted carrots, and wild greens sautéed in goat fat. They're placed in large wooden bowls beside slabs of meat, and everyone digs in. There are no forks, just knives and fingers. And no plates. Only rounds of old bread or wooden trenchers. One curious note: meat was often boiled first, then roasted. This both softened it and gave broth for soup. Viking cooking, it turns out, was efficient, every drop of flavor extracted. A ladle dips into a bubbling cauldron. Out comes stew thick with barley and chunks of lamb. A drizzle of sour cream. A few herbs. It's not fine dining, but it's hearty, and in this cold, hearty winds. Then comes a strange dish, blood pudding. Made with animal blood, barley, and spices, it's boiled into thick, dark slices. Not everyone's favorite, but nothing was wasted. Eat the blood, or spill your own, the warriors joked. Laughter rolls through the hall. A young boy tries to sneak a second piece of pork and gets caught. His punishment? Telling a story about a troll in the outhouse. It's terrible. Everyone laughs anyway. Beer flows. Not strong, but steady. Mead too reserved for toasts and high moments. And with every mug comes a tale. The raid that went wrong. The goat that escaped its own stew pot. The time someone mistook a priest for a troll. True or not didn't matter. They were part of the meal. And then the singing starts. Deep voices, off-key, echoing in rhythm. The words are old, the meaning half forgotten, but the feeling? Timeless. At the heart of it all is Sumble, the ritual. Of shared toasts, a horn is passed, filled with mead. Each person drinks and offers a boast, a promise, or a memory. One swears to build a better boat. Another recalls a father long gone. A third half-drunk promises to catch the biggest cod in the fjord. They all cheer. No one believes him. One woman stands, lifts the horn, and toasts the gods. Then the ancestors. then the earth itself. The hall falls quiet for a moment, just long enough to remember that food wasn't just survival, it was connection. To each other, to history, to the world beyond. Outside, snow begins to fall. Inside, the fire roars. Feasts were not just about plenty. They were reminders that the lean days would return, that hunger was never far, that joy must be grasped fiercely when it appeared, and sometimes feasts ended with a gift. A guest sent home with a pouch of dried apples, a bone wrapped in cloth, a loaf of barley bread, still warm. Not because they were rich, but because sharing was survival. The oddest gift? A preserved goosefoot meant to ward off bad weather. It didn't work. But no one told the giver. As the night deepens, the feast fades. Plates are cleared, ashes swept. The last of the mead swallowed. Someone snores in the corner, using a cloak as a pillow. Tomorrow, it's back to porridge and dried cod. But tonight they dine like gods. The embers are quiet now. Morning dew clings to herbs in the garden like tiny stars caught in green lace. Beyond the longhouse, soft footsteps rustle through straw-covered paths. A hand plucks a leek from the soil. Another snips a handful of dill, brushing away a sleepy bee. There are no grand rituals here, just the steady work of growing what will become meals. This is the Viking pantry. Not a shelf or a cupboard, but a patch of earth. You might picture the Vikings as axe-swinging warriors in fur, but more often they were gardeners. And it was these quiet, daily acts of cultivation that truly fed the family. Each longhouse had its tun, a small, enclosed area near the home. Here grew the household's most essential flavor makers: leeks, onions, garlic, turnips, carrots, and herbs like thyme, yarrow, and lovage. The soil, though rocky in places, was surprisingly fertile near fjords and river valleys. And Viking women knew how to coax life from it. Leeks were the rock stars of the garden. Hardy, fast-growing, and usable in almost everything. Viking stew. Without leeks, unthinkable. Sliced into porridge, boiled with barley, fried with scraps of goat fat. If it didn't include leeks, someone probably forgot to cook. Garlic was trickier. It required dry ground and careful storage, but its flavor was so prized that cloves were sometimes strung around the neck, not to eat, but to ward off illness and bad spirits. A double duty, if you will. Turnips, too, were everywhere. Roasted, mashed, stewed. They stood in for potatoes centuries before potatoes even existed in Europe. Paired with onions and a ladle of sour cream, they created something the Vikings might dare call comfort food, if they ever had the time to relax. Historians still debate the extent of herb use in Viking cooking. Some suggest herbs were reserved for medicine. Others believe they flavored everyday meals generously. Archaeological evidence shows charred dill seeds in cooking pots and traces of wild mustard on roasting stones, so perhaps the truth is both. Medicine and flavor were rarely separate, and then there were the greens, wild and cultivated alike. Nettle was a surprising favorite. It stung raw, but boiled down into a soft, spinach-like green that added iron and texture to soups. Cabbage, too, appeared in some regions, though it's debated whether it was native or an import via trade. One strange culinary trick. Viking cooks would toss a smooth stone into their stew pot. The hot stone kept the heat even and helped release flavor. From the root vegetables It also gave children something to fight over once the stew was done. Whoever licked it clean got first choice of the crusty bread, seasonal fruits filled in the sweetness. Apples, picked in early autumn and dried on rooftop slats. Bilberries and lingonberries, gathered in late summer. Gooseberries, if the birds didn't get them first. The berries were boiled into thick pastes or left to ferment slightly, making a tart jelly-like sauce that paired well with pork. And let's not forget legumes, broad beans, and peas. These were often mashed into thick pastes or added to barley to create heavy, filling meals. A pot of pea porridge might last 2 days, reheated each morning with a bit more water and a whisper of salt. One folktale tells of a young woman who disguised herself as a man and won a cooking contest by sneaking meat into her pea stew. The judges never forgave her or stopped asking for the recipe. In hard winters, preserved herbs from the summer garden were like gold. A few sprigs of dried thyme could lift a pot of thin soup into something warm and fragrant. Parsley and angelica stored well and were chewed raw for digestion or just to freshen breath after a garlic-heavy feast. The oddest pantry item: tree bark. In desperate years, birch bark was dried and ground into powder, then mixed with barley to stretch the flour. Not tasty. But when the snows were late to melt, bark bread was better than nothing. Even in the garden, ritual played a role. Seeds were sometimes blessed before planting. A pinch of ashes from the hearth might be sprinkled into the soil for luck. And when the first leak poked its head through, a child was sent to greet it, usually with a silly rhyme and a poorly hidden snack offering. The pantry extended beyond the garden, too. In the forest, women and children foraged for mushrooms, wild garlic, and wood sorrel. In wetlands, they gathered bog cranberries and marsh mint. And near the shore, they picked sea kale and rack, a kind of seaweed boiled into stews or laid over roasting meat for salt and moisture. By evening, the harvest was sorted, leeks braided and hung, onions placed in cool corners, berries dried and packed into clay jars. The day's yield was small, but precious. Dinner might be a simple leek and barley stew, with a crumble of goat cheese and a drizzle of berry paste. It wasn't fancy, but it was real. Grown with patience, cooked with care, shared with quiet satisfaction. And when the wind howled outside and the pantry seemed thin, a single dried apple or spoonful of pickled turnip reminded everyone: the land gives, and with enough hands it gives again. The air carries a different smell today. Not earth or bread, but wood smoke, sharp and dry. Beyond the long house, smoke curls up in thin ribbons from a small stone hut. Inside, racks of meat glisten in the firelight, dripping slowly, quietly. This isn't a feast, it's a strategy. A way to cheat time. To keep hunger at bay when the world turns white and the rivers freeze over. Welcome to the Viking Preservation Room. In a land where winters stretched like old wolves across the landscape. Survival meant planning, and planning meant preserving food before it spoiled. The summer sun might be generous, but it never lasted long. A successful Viking family didn't just harvest, they preserved. With salt, with smoke, with cold, with cunning. The first method, and arguably the oldest, was drying. Fish, meat, berries, anything with moisture was hung beneath the eaves of the house or laid out on flat stones. The sun and wind did the rest. Cod, especially, was transformed into stockfish a hard, lightweight slab of protein that could last for months. You didn't bite into it, you chiseled, then boiled it until it softened, or as softened as it was ever going to get. Sour preservation was just as common. Cabbages, turnips, even apples were packed into clay jars with water and salt, weighted with stones, and left to ferment. The result? A sharp, tangy slaw that tickled the tongue and kept digestion running during heavy winter meals. It wasn't always pretty, but it worked. Some Viking families even added herbs or wild garlic to the mix, turning necessity into cuisine. Historians still debate the exact methods used to ferment fish. Some believe they buried it underground to ferment in its own oils. Others suggest it was aged in barrels layered with seaweed. The truth might lie somewhere in between. What's certain is this: the smell was unforgettable. In some sagas, warriors joke that spoiled shark could empty a feast hall faster than fire. Salt curing was a luxury. Salt had to be traded or painstakingly gathered from coastal evaporation. But if you had it, you could pack meat or fish between layers of the white crystals and store it for seasons. Salted pork belly, in particular, was a favorite. Not just for its flavor, but its fat content, which gave energy and warmth in the cold months. And then, of course, came the smokehou. Imagine a dark hut, barely big enough for a person to stand upright. Inside, wooden racks hold slabs of fish and meat. A small fire smolders below, not with flame, but with smoke dense and fragrant from juniper branches or seaweed. The smoke dries and flavors at once. Salmon, lamb, even horse meat passed through this ritual, emerging with a dark, protective crust. This wasn't a quick job. Meat might smoke for days, even weeks. Someone had to keep the fire going, stirring coals, adjusting airflow, ensuring the temperature never got too hot. Too much heat, and the meat would cook, not cure. That was a mistake only made once. Viking children learned the smell of good smoke from a young age. Not too sweet, not too sour. Just enough to sting the eyes and wake the appetite. Sometimes they played games near the smokehouse. One involved tossing bits of dried meat into each other's mouths from a distance. Another was more of a test of courage, holding your breath and stepping into the dense smoke, counting heartbeats before stumbling out gasping. The oddest preservation trick: butter burial. Yes, butter. Rich, creamy, churned from goat or cow milk. In the warm months, it spoiled fast. But buried deep in peat bogs, cold, damp, and nearly airtight, it could last for years. Archaeologists have actually found 1,000-year-old Viking butter, still intact, still technically edible. And then there was skyr. Think of it as a cross between yogurt and soft cheese. Made by warming milk, adding rennet, straining out the whey, and letting it age. Skyr was packed into wooden tubs and sealed with a layer of animal fat. It fermented slowly, growing thicker and sharper with time. Some say it was an acquired taste. Others say it was the soul of the Norse pantry. Grains, too, were stored carefully. After harvest, barley and rye were dried over low fires, then stored in sacks or barrels in raised storage buildings, cool, dry, and safe from rodents. Spoiled grain was a disaster. Not just a waste, but dangerous. Molds could make people sick or hallucinate. Some sagas speak of bread that whispered or porridge that spoke, likely a poetic way of describing Mold-induced delirium. During Yule, the midwinter celebration, families opened their best preserved foods: salted lamb, dried apples, smoked eel, even honey cakes made months earlier and stored in sealed jars. It was a time to show off how well you'd planned, how carefully you'd preserved, and maybe to boast just a little about that skyr tub still fresh after 80 days. But preservation wasn't just about survival. It was about rhythm, about listening to the land and its seasons. When the berries ripened, it was time to make jam. When the air turned dry and sharp, it was time to hang the fish. When the goats gave milk, it was time to churn and bury the butter. It was about teaching children when to pluck herbs and when to salt meat. It was about patience, precision, and pride. And when the blizzards came, when the fjords froze and the wind howled against the longhouse walls, it was about sitting by the hearth, slicing into a piece of smoked lamb, and tasting sunlight from a season long past. The snow outside piles high, blanketing the world in silence. But inside the longhouse, the warmth hums with quiet activity. There's a clatter of wooden bowls, the low murmur of stories passed between old friends, and the occasional crackle of logs settling deeper into the fire. Mealtime isn't just about eating. It's about how food is shared. Viking dining had its own rhythm, not rushed, not idle. Something in between, practical ballet of family, community, and custom. Meals were moments of togetherness, where stories flowed as easily as broth and laughter echoed louder than the creaking rafters. The longhouse was both kitchen and dining room. At its center blazed the hearth, often stretching the length of the hall. Smoke drifted upward through the rafters or out a small smoke hole in the roof, depending on the design. The fire wasn't just for cooking, it was the heart of the home, the warm pulse that kept everyone going. Meals were taken sitting along the walls, backs to the timber, bowls in laps, and spoons in hand. Tables were rare, usually reserved for feasts or formal gatherings. A wooden bench might serve in place of a table during larger meals, with food laid out for those sitting close by. Food was served from shared pots or large wooden bowls. Everyone helped themselves, usually starting with the eldest and ending with the youngest. It wasn't always equal, but it was always observed. Elders and warriors often received the best cuts, a reminder of their role in defending and providing for the community. Still, Viking hospitality ran deep. If a stranger arrived at your door, especially in winter, you were expected to offer food, no matter how little you had. Turning someone away hungry was not only dishonorable, it risked attracting the wrath of the gods. Hospitality was sacred. What was on the menu? The usual suspects: barley porridge, root vegetables, dried or stewed meat, and broth-rich stews flavored with herbs or onions. Occasionally, if the day had gone especially well, a bit of honey or skyr might appear at the end. But sweets were rare and savored. One of the most cherished dishes was called grit, a thick barley porridge, sometimes sweetened with dried fruits or stirred with goat's milk. It was hearty, filling, and endlessly customizable. Children would beg for the browned edges that stuck to the pot, crisp, chewy, and full of flavor. If grit appeared at breakfast and again at supper, no one complained. It was that good. Another common feature was flatbread, made with barley or rye flour, water, and a bit of salt. It was rolled thin and cooked on a hot stone or iron plate. Some were soft and warm, folded over meat or cheese. Others were dried until hard and kept for weeks, ready to be softened in soup or eaten as is with a smear of butter. Historians still debate whether communal drinking horns were used in everyday meals or reserved solely for special feasts. Some believe it was common to pass a horn around at evening meals, while others argue it was symbolic, used only in ceremonies. The truth may be both: a drinking horn at a humble supper, a polished silver-trimmed one at a wedding, but not everything was shared. Children sometimes hoarded berries or bits of meat in small leather pouches, snacks for later or trade goods with friends. One Viking child was even buried with a small pouch of dried apples, suggesting that favorite foods held value beyond hunger. A snack, a memory, a treasure. And then there was mead. Not an everyday drink. Mead was expensive, made from fermented honey. But when it appeared, it was a sign that something good had happened: a birth, a wedding, a successful raid. Mead was passed around with stories, songs, and the occasional boast that stretched the truth like a fishtail. Vikings weren't just warriors, they were entertainers. Sometimes dinner ended with a tale. An elder would clear their throat, stir the fire, and begin a saga, a memory, a dream. Children leaned close, eyes wide. Adults nodded, lips moving along with the familiar parts. These weren't just stories, they were recipes for living. How to be brave, how to be clever, how to endure. Mealtime was also the stage for humor. Jokes flew fast, especially when food was good. One common joke among farmers involved mocking their own meals. "If this porridge gets any thinner, I'll need a net to catch it." Or, "My bread is so hard, I gave it to the blacksmith to use as a hammer." Light teasing helped pass the time and bond the table together. Unusual habits crept in, too. Some Vikings believed it was bad luck to whistle during meals. It might call spirits into the hearth. Others swore that if you dropped your spoon 3 times, a guest was on their way. Whether superstition or jest, these quirks flavored the daily rhythm. Ceremony was woven into even the smallest things. A bit of food was sometimes left uneaten, not wasted, but offered silently to the land spirits or ancestors. A gesture of respect, a way of saying, "We haven't forgotten you." But make no mistake, meals could also be chaotic. Dogs barking for scraps, babies fussing, someone burning their tongue on stew and cursing softly behind a hand, a sudden gust blowing smoke back into the house. Real life, noisy and unpredictable, just as it always is around a busy dinner. Still, the Viking table was more than wood and bowls. It was a gathering place, a classroom, a stage. It taught the next generation how to be Viking, not just through stories, but through behavior. Respect the food. Honor your guests. Share when you can. Laugh when it's needed. And maybe save the last piece of dried apple for someone who might need it more than you. The fire dims and flickers low. Outside, the stars blink through the black sky like cold, watchful eyes. Yet inside the longhouse, the day's work gives way to something quieter: preservation. Not of stories or rituals this time, but of food. Because surviving in the North meant thinking ahead. Long ahead. Winter was not a season to be underestimated. It was a test. And the Vikings, hardened by years of coastal storms and thin harvests, met it with cunning. The art of food preservation wasn't a luxury, it was a survival skill. And Every household, from humble farmers to proud jarls, relied on it. Salt, smoke, ice, air. These were their tools. Let's begin with salt. Salted meat was a staple of Viking preservation, though salt itself could be expensive and wasn't always readily available inland. Coastal dwellers had easier access, scraping salt from evaporated seawater or trading for it. Pork and fish were the usual candidates for salting, packed tight in wooden barrels. The salt drew out moisture and locked bacteria out, leaving behind a chewier, tougher but long-lasting source of protein. Then came smoke, a far more common method, and honestly, a tastier one too. Longhouses often had meat or fish dangling above the hearth, drying and smoking for days. The low, steady heat and thick, aromatic smoke added flavor while protecting against rot. A smoked leg of lamb could hang for weeks, sometimes longer, sliced thin and eaten cold, or simmered back to life in a pot of stew. Fish, particularly herring and cod, were smoked in great quantities. Along the coast, entire sheds were dedicated to the task, with racks of split fish gently turning golden brown under plumes of smoke. The smell was unmistakable, sharp, oily, comforting. Oddly enough, there's evidence that Vikings also air-dried fish in the open, especially in colder climates where the air was dry and biting. Fish were split, splayed, and hung like laundry from wooden racks in the wind. The result? A stiff, nearly petrified version called stockfish. It could last months, maybe longer. You'd have to beat it with a hammer before cooking. No joke. Vikings didn't just eat to live. They worked hard to make the food edible again after storing it. And when winter rolled in fully, nature became their freezer. Barrels of butter, tubs of milk, baskets of root vegetables, all could be kept in cellars or even outdoors, so long as animals were kept away. The cold acted as a natural fridge, but it wasn't perfect. A sudden thaw could spoil entire stores. So every village had backup plans, more preserved meats, more dried grains, more fish. Redundancy was survival. Speaking of grain, let's not forget beer. Yes, beer was a form of preservation too. Made from fermented barley, Viking beer was low in alcohol, thick, and sometimes flavored with herbs like yarrow or juniper. It provided calories, hydration, and maybe a bit of cheer during the long nights. It was stored in clay or wooden casks, sealed with beeswax or leather to keep the air out. Historians still debate whether the Vikings added hops to their beer. Hops would have acted as a preservative, and while evidence is thin, some suspect that trade with continental Europe introduced the practice earlier than we thought. Either way, beer was common enough that some families brewed it weekly. Often women, who managed much of the household production. Let's not forget dairy. Milk didn't last long on its own, so the Vikings turned it into more stable forms: butter, cheese, and skyr. Skyr, a thick, tangy, fermented milk product, was somewhere between yogurt and cheese. It could be eaten fresh, but also dried into curds that kept far longer. Kids might chew on it like candy. Adults appreciated its gut-friendly qualities, especially when meals were mostly meat and bread. And for an unusual treat, how about blood? Yes, you heard that right. Blood was never wasted. It could be mixed with barley or oats to make a thick pudding or sausage. Boiled, cooled, sliced, and fried. Rich in iron, practical, and oddly tasty when spiced. This wasn't taboo, it was thrift. A favorite winter dish in some regions was blood sausage. You'd take a clean sheep's stomach, fill it with a mixture of blood, fat, and oats, and boil it until firm. A few slices of that, next to some root vegetables, made for a warming, filling meal. If that makes you raise an eyebrow, you're not alone. Even modern Nordic folk admit it's an acquired taste. Sometimes, preservation crossed into ritual. The slaughter of livestock in the fall, called blot, was both practical and spiritual. Animals were culled before winter to reduce the number-needing feed. The blood and meat were offered to the gods, and the preserved cuts sustained families for months. In this sense, preservation wasn't just about food, it was about honoring cycles, life, death, renewal. Some of these customs survive today. In curious ways, Icelandic hakarl, fermented shark, is a direct descendant of old Viking preservation techniques. It's buried, rotted, dried, and cut into chewy cubes. You'll either love it or swear never to eat it again. Either way, it's Viking ingenuity at its most extreme. But all of this work wasn't just to feed the body. It fed peace of mind. There's something calming about opening a cellar and seeing rows of smoked fish, baskets of dried peas, wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth. It meant the family would make it. At least for now, children learned these skills early. How to salt fish without wasting the brine. How to dry herbs without crushing them. How to wrap cheese in moss to keep the bugs off. These were as vital as knowing how to wield a sword. Maybe more, and in some cases, preservation was a form of currency. Good wheel of cheese or a tub of salted butter could be traded for cloth, tools, or grain. Even marriages were arranged around preserved food stocks. A farmer who could feed his bride through winter. That was worth more than gold, so the next time you freeze a casserole or vacuum seal leftovers, know that you're standing on the shoulders of Vikings. They didn't have electricity, fridges, or plastic wrap. They had smoke, salt, snow, and an unshakable determination to make it through the cold. And if they could wring flavor out of dried cod and goat's milk, who are we to complain? When the long ships creaked out to sea weather for trade, exploration, or war, the Vikings had to think like sailors, survivalists, and chefs all at once. Life on the move was harsh. Meals weren't about taste. They were about endurance. And yet, even on the salty decks of warships or the muddy trails of inland raids, the Viking people carried a part of home with them, their food. So what did a Viking carry into battle or on a voyage that could last weeks or months? Start with the basics: hardtack and dried fish. Hardtack, often just called travel bread, was a dry, hard biscuit made from barley or rye flour, water, and sometimes salt. No leavening, no flavor, just dense, dry sustenance. It was baked until nearly rock hard and stored in cloth sacks. The only way to eat it was to soak it in broth or ale or risk breaking a tooth. But it lasted forever, sometimes literally. Archaeologists have found pieces of Viking-era hardtack still intact in graves. Alongside that came dried fish, usually stockfish. This was cod or haddock, dried until it turned into something more like wood than food. It was light, it didn't spoil, and it packed protein. You'd need to beat it with a rock or soak it overnight to soften it up. Imagine chewing on jerky that had fought back. Still, it gave strength and calories, especially during cold ocean nights. Some warriors or merchants carried smoked meats too, if they had the resources. These were luxury items, smoked lamb or pork wrapped in cloth or leather. They didn't last as long as dried fish, but were prized for their flavor. A bite of smoked meat after days of hardtack? That was morale, but voyages weren't fueled by protein alone. Grains played a part too. Oats and barley could be boiled into porridge on board the ship, especially when a fire was possible, though cooking at sea was dangerous and rare. More often, gruel was prepared ahead of time and stored cold and sealed. Clay pots or animal bladders. Unappetizing? Maybe, but a cold spoonful of barley mush kept your stomach from turning inside out. Then came butter and lard-fat stores. Butter, packed in wooden barrels, was used to coat bread, preserve meat, or simply eat by the spoonful when energy was running low. Lard, meanwhile, was often mixed with onions or herbs and stored in animal stomachs or leather bags. Both were high in calories, vital in cold weather or during battles. One of the lesser-known travel companions. Beer and mead, small barrels of weak ale, were common aboard ships, not just for drinking, but for cleaning wounds or making hard bread palatable. Mead, being stronger and more precious, was typically reserved for celebrations after raids or as offerings during rituals. Still, a hidden flask could lift spirits on a cold voyage to the British Isles or the icy rivers of Eastern Europe. And don't forget herbs and salt. Small pouches of dried herbs like angelica, juniper, or wild onion were carried for both flavor and medicine. A bit of crushed root in your porridge or brewed into tea could soothe a cough or keep scurvy at bay. Salt wasn't just seasoning, it was currency. And it kept everything else from rotting too fast. One ingenious Viking method for travel food was soup stones. A smooth, heat-retaining rock was brought along from the hearth at home. Heated over a fire or even in the sun, it could be dropped into a pot of water to help boil it faster. It wasn't the food itself, but a way to make food quicker. Smart, efficient, portable. Now, let's shift from food to moments. Imagine warrior lean, sunburnt, and wind-chapped pulling a strip of dried fish from his belt. He chews in silence as the ship rocks under his feet. Around him, the crew does the same. A handful of barley gruel, a gulp of lukewarm ale, then nothing. Just waves and the groan of the hull. Food, in these moments, was not communal or ceremonial. It was functional, but in its own way, still sacred, because each bite carried memory. A mother's hand grinding flour, a father smoking fish on the homestead, a child helping press butter into a wooden cask. That hardtack wasn't just food, it was a link to home. And for raiders, food often became treasure. Monasteries in England and Ireland didn't just store gold, they stored food. Grain cellars, wine, cheese, butter. Vikings raided these not only for wealth, but for winter supplies. One raid could stock a ship with enough to feed a village for weeks. Food was power. Food was survival. On the return trip, ships were heavier loaded, not only with stolen goods, but preserved food, livestock, and sometimes foreign delicacies. Honey from Francia, spices from the East, exotic grains. Every voyage became a culinary lesson, a reshaping of the Norse palate. And food wasn't just outbound. Traders and explorers brought Viking food to new lands. Settlers in Iceland, Greenland, and even Newfoundland brought hardtack, butter, barley, and cheese molds. Viking cuisine, blunt and practical, followed the oars wherever they went. Even graves show us this truth. In ship burials, warriors were often laid to rest with food. Dried meats, beer, bowls of grain. Not because they needed calories in death, but because food was life. To be fed was to be honored. To carry food into the afterlife was to ensure your soul never went hungry. So next time you hear the clink of a spoon on a bowl, or feel the crunch of dried bread, remember, someone on a wind-tossed Viking ship once did the same. Far from land, far from home, but never far from the food that kept their spirit burning. And in that bite, they carried a whole world. As the flickering torchlight casts shadows on stone walls, a quiet circle forms. No laughter, no idle chatter, only solemn focus. At the center, a bowl of barley, a horn of mead, and a carved wooden idol. This was no ordinary meal. This was a ritual feast, and every bite was an offering, not just for nourishment, but for the gods. In Viking culture, food wasn't just for the living. It fed the dead, it honored ancestors, and it pleased divine beings who, in return, might bless harvests, grant victories, or ensure a safe return from war. One of the most sacred meals was the blod, a sacrificial feast held during seasonal festivals like Yule or Midsummer. At the heart of this ritual was the animal sacrifice, usually a pig, goat, or even a horse. These were not random killings. They were ceremonial acts, often held at large farmsteads or temples, like the one at Uppsala in Sweden. The blood of the animal, called lot, was collected in bowls and sprinkled on the altars, the statues of the gods, and even the people. It was believed to bind the participants to the divine and secure favor. The meat was then boiled in massive iron cauldrons, often using heated stones instead of direct fire, and shared among the community in a sacred meal. Imagine the smell. Boiling meat, steam rising, herbs thrown in for flavor and symbolism, onion, garlic, maybe angelica. Everyone received a portion, but the first cut always went to the gods, laid on the altar or burned in the fire. This wasn't waste. It was tribute. Odin, Thor, Freyr each had their favorite offerings. Freyr, the god of fertility and harvest, was given boars. Thor, guardian of mankind, often received goats. Odin, the Allfather, was honored with blood and mead. In some traditions, Odin demanded the best cut of meat, hung or pierced, echoing his self-sacrifice on the world tree. And then came the mead suite. Golden and laced with symbolism. Mead wasn't just a drink. It was poetry, magic, and memory. During these rituals, it was passed around the circle in a horn, with each person making a toast called a mini. First to the gods, then to the king or chieftain, and finally to the ancestors. These toasts weren't casual. Each word carried weight, each sip a vow. These ritual meals created a rare moment of unity. All classes, slaves, farmers, warriors, jarls, ate together. In that moment, all were equal before the gods. Food became the great leveler, and it wasn't just the large sacrifices that mattered. In the home, smaller hearth rituals were common. A slice of bread might be placed on the windowsill for a house spirit. A bit of porridge left outside for the ancestors. Even during famine, Vikings found ways to share food with the unseen. Because in their world, food was faith. Burial rites also reveal this connection. Archaeologists have unearthed Viking graves where the dead were laid to rest with full meals, sometimes in bowls, sometimes wrapped in cloth. In Oseberg, Norway, 2 women buried with a ship had a literal pantry with them: apples, nuts, beef, bread, and even cooking tools. This wasn't just for show. These were real preparations for the afterlife. Just as they'd eat in life, they'd feast in death. Certain foods had symbolic meanings. Bread represented stability and community. Ale and mead were for celebration and transformation. Boiled lamb often symbolized sacrifice. Fish tied the living to the ocean's spirits, especially in coastal communities where gods like Gyr and Ran were revered. Even table manners took on spiritual meaning. One could not eat before the offering. To spill mead was a bad omen, and to refuse shared food was to insult not only the host, but the gods witnessing the act. During seasonal festivals, especially Yule, food became a bridge between worlds. Yule was more than a midwinter celebration. It was a time when the veil between the living and the dead thinned. People believed their ancestors returned to visit, so they cooked extra, left places open at the table, and made sure the hearth fire never died. The smell of roasting meat, baking bread, and boiling herbs was believed to guide the spirits home. Sometimes sacred fires were used to cook ritual meals. These fires couldn't be used for anything else. If someone disrespected the cooking or failed to share properly, it wasn't just rude, it was dangerous. The gods were watching, and in Norse myth, divine punishment was swift. Yet, ritual meals weren't always solemn. Some were joyful, loud, and filled with song. The sharing of food became the sharing of stories, poems, and sagas. A bowl of stew passed with a tale of Thor's hammer, a sip of mead followed by a joke about Loki's tricks. This blend of food and myth made every ritual memorable and a live dot. So what does this teach us? That, for the Vikings, eating was sacred. Not just a necessity of life, but a ceremony that connected earth to sky, man to God, memory to future. Each bite had meaning. Each meal a prayer. And when they sat in circles under stars, passing bowls carved by hand, whispering to their gods as steam curled into the night, they weren't just surviving. They were belonging to their people, to their ancestors, to their gods. Salted herring from the Baltic, raisins from the east, even peppercorns from far-off lands placed carefully into carved wooden bowls on Viking tables. These ingredients didn't grow on Scandinavian soil. So how did they get here? Trade, bold, relentless, seafaring trade. The Vikings weren't just warriors and raiders. They were merchants, expert navigators who built a thriving web of trade stretching from Greenland to Baghdad. And while weapons and silver often stole the headlines, one quiet but powerful force flowed beneath it all: foreign food. By the 9th century, Viking ships had carved out routes to the British Isles, the Carolingian Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and even the Islamic caliphates. These journeys brought more than wealth, they brought flavor. Take salt, for instance. Though found locally in some areas, the Vikings often acquired high-quality salt from trading hubs like Dorestad and Rib. Salt wasn't just for taste. It was essential for preserving meat and fish, turning perishable food into survival rations for long winters or longer voyages. Salted herring became a staple, and then there were spices. No, not the elaborate Indian blends we know today, but black pepper, cinnamon, and common rare and prized. These were luxury items showing up in high-status burials and ceremonial meals. One peppercorn found in a Viking grave in Denmark suggests it was likely used with reverence, perhaps saved for a single important dish, or even placed on the tongue of the dead as a final offering. Imagine the surprise of a Norse farmer tasting pepper for the first time, fiery, sharp, completely unfamiliar. They didn't always understand these exotic ingredients, but they respected them, often blending them with local herbs to suit Nordic tastes. One unusual import? Walnuts. Not native to Scandinavia, walnuts were carried in from the south. Archaeologists found them in Viking Age layers of York and Hidibi. These nuts were tough to crack and tough to trade, but worth it. Their richness made them popular additions to festival cakes and ceremonial dishes, tiny crunches of wealth in an otherwise soft meal. Foreign food wasn't just about flavor. It was also status. Owning raisins or figs meant you had connections, either through trade or battle. Some Vikings brought home foreign foods after raiding monastic kitchens in England or Ireland. Others received them as gifts of diplomacy, exchanged with Slavic or Byzantine envoys. These goods ended up in feasts, shared in longhouses where every bite whispered, "This came from afar." And what about drinks? Vikings brewed their own ale and mead, but foreign beverages left their mark. Wine, especially from Francia and southern Europe, was imported and savored. It was rare, expensive, and often served during blots or high feasts. One shipwreck off the coast of Sweden revealed wine amphorae, likely stolen or traded from southern traders. But not every foreign food was embraced. Some attempts to grow Mediterranean fruits like grapes or figs failed miserably in the northern climate. Still, dried versions made their way up on trade routes. In Birka, Sweden, archaeologists uncovered fig seeds in what was likely a wealthy merchant's home. There's even debate about rice. Some scholars believe the Viking Vikings encountered rice during their eastern journeys, especially along the Volga trade route to the Caspian Sea. But did they eat it? Prepare it? Pass it on as a curiosity? Historians still debate whether rice ever made it into the Viking diet, or if it was simply another trade good that changed hands without entering kitchens. Still, it's likely that the Vikings were more experimental eaters than we give them credit for. Their food, though rooted in practicality and preservation, adapted. When exposed to new ingredients, they tried things, blended them, modified traditional stews with dried fruits, spiced, salted meats with Eastern flavors. Even early onion cultivation was influenced by contact with the South. And one truly odd import? Silfim, a now extinct herb, possibly used in some high-end Viking medicines or perfumes. Though it likely never became a staple, its presence in old texts suggests a curiosity for flavor and scent beyond the fjords. Foreign food didn't just feed the Vikings. It changed them. As they traded, they tasted. As they raided, they discovered. Their kitchens, though humble and smoky, became places of quiet innovation. Imagine a longhouse in Denmark, a stew simmering over the hearth. A jarl leans forward, sniffs, and asks, "What is that?" "Raisins," replies a cook. From the south, he nods, curious, maybe pleased, maybe skeptical, but he tastes it, and maybe, just maybe, he tells the skald to remember the dish because in the Viking world, memory was power and food was a way to carry the world home. Crumbs scatter across the carved wooden floor as a pair of small hands fumble with a hunk of rye bread. A toddler smacks their lips, cheeks dusted with ash and flour, while a mother watches from across the hearth, stirring a thin barley porridge. In Viking households, children didn't eat separately. They were part of the food ritual, learning, mimicking, tasting from the very beginning. Meals were moments of silent education. From as early as age 3 or 4, children were expected to participate not just in eating, but in food preparation. Whether it was gathering berries, helping to churn butter, or tending goats, food wasn't just nourishment. It was apprenticeship. Unlike modern childhoods filled with snacks and treats, Viking children ate what everyone else did, just in smaller portions. Their early meals were soft, simple, and made for tiny hands. Porridges of oats or barley, mashed root vegetables, broth steeped from leftover bones, and when available, bits of soft cheese or egg, and of course, bread. Always bread. Thick slabs of dense rye or barley bread, sometimes dipped in milk to soften. This wasn't the airy bread we know today. It was tough, chewy, and filling. It could be a teething ring as much as a meal. Oddly enough, Viking children also learned the dangers of food early on. Mistaking poisonous berries for safe ones was a known risk, especially when foraging. Some sagas mention children being warned, through both stories and consequences, not to touch certain mushrooms or plants. One curious tale from Iceland speaks of a girl punished for eating unripe cloudberries, leading to a superstitious belief that greedy tongues invite winter's curse. Food education wasn't only practical, it was spiritual. Mealtime prayers weren't long, but they acknowledged the gods. Before eating, some families would raise a piece of bread or pour a few drops of milk onto the ground, a simple offering to Thor or Freyr, thanking them for the harvest or safe returns, and children watched. They watched as elders salted fish. They watched mothers butcher hens. They watched fathers chew dried meat while describing distant seas. And slowly they understood the weight food carried, not just in calories, but in meaning. Many learned to cook by age 10, not gourmet meals, but the essentials. A girl might know how to make a basic porridge, stir curdled milk into cheese, or smoke fish over a fire. A boy might assist in roasting meat or gathering herbs with his grandmother. In some households, gender roles blurred, especially if help was needed. Cooking was survival, not ceremony. Still, the Viking Age had its social training too. Children were taught not to eat before elders, to share the last piece, and to never waste bread, even the hard crusts. It was believed that discarded bread could offend house spirits, leading to spoiled stores or failed harvests. So even crumbs had value. What about sweets? There weren't many, but there were some. Honey, when available, was a precious treat. Children might be given a bit of honeycomb to chew, or a sweetened gruel on feast days. Wild berries like lingonberries, bilberries, and rowan berries were also considered treats, sometimes mashed into a paste or fermented slightly for unique flavors. And occasionally, a truly strange childhood snack. Tree bark, that's right. In times of famine, Viking children might eat bark bread, a mix of flour and inner birch bark. Not because it tasted good, but because it filled the stomach. Some modern Scandinavians still bake it as a historical curiosity. Education around food extended beyond cooking and eating. It included gathering, storing, and seasonal awareness. Children learned which mushrooms were edible, when to pick wild onions, how to dry herbs for the winter, and what a spoiled egg smelled like. These lessons weren't taught in a classroom. They were whispered during chores, shouted over fields, and passed down with every bowl dot. In richer households, children might also be introduced to imported goods. A noble child tasting a raisin, for the first time, might mistake it for a bug. Or a bit of eastern spice might cause puckered lips and wide eyes. These experiences taught more than just taste. They were lessons in wealth, privilege, and curiosity. There's a peculiar record from Hidibi of a child buried with a small wooden spoon carved with a goat on the handle. Some believe this suggests a sense of pride in food roles, a symbol of one's first steps into adulthood. Historians still debate whether Viking children played formal roles in large feasts, or if they were tucked away during the celebrations. Some think only older boys were allowed to serve mead, learning diplomacy at the elbow of their fathers. Others believe young children sat silently, wide-eyed at the stories, their fingers tracing cracks in the communal table. One thing is certain: mealtime was never just mealtime. It was training. It was discipline. It was faith. Children didn't need lectures to understand food's importance. They lived it. Every berry picked, every goat milked, every fish cleaned was part of a longer story. By 15, most Viking teens were fully integrated into the adult food system. They hunted, baked, gathered, and preserved. Some were even married by then, expected to run their own hearths, and all of this started with a piece of bread in a chubby hand. The longhouse glows with firelight, flickering against rows of bearded faces and plaited hair. A roasted lamb turns slowly over the hearth, crackling fat hissing as it drips into the coals. The scent of smoke and garlic fills the air, mingling with laughter, music, and the low hum of anticipation. Tonight isn't just about eating, it's a feast. Feasts in Viking society weren't everyday affairs. They marked something special: a harvest, a marriage, a birth, a victory, or a burial. And when they happened, they transformed everything. Food became memory, religion, spectacle. The guest list varied by region and wealth, but in every case, the seating arrangement mattered. The most honored guests sat closest to the fire, where the food came out hottest and quickest, farther from the hearth. Cooler dishes, less mead, fewer stories. But the heat wasn't the only thing that traveled in waves. So did status. The farther one sat from the host, the lower one stood in the social ladder. And just like at modern weddings, there were rivalries, whispered drama, and the occasional scandal. One tale from Norway speaks of a noblewoman refusing to sit beside a fisherman at a feast, resulting in a petty mead war that ended in a tavern brawl. Still, the focus was the food. Main dishes at these events could be truly grand: whole pigs roasted over pits, fish wrapped in herbs and seaweed, slabs of beef soaked in ale before cooking. There were sausages stuffed with blood and barley, smoked lamb with honey glaze, and for the especially rich exotic goods like dried figs or imported wine. Unusual? Always. One bizarre dish mentioned in saga lore includes fermented seal meat, aged for months underground. This sour, pungent meat was considered a delicacy in remote coastal communities, though even back then, not everyone agreed it was worth the smell. Religious elements often framed these gatherings, feasts tied to blots, or sacrificial rituals had a dual purpose: to honor the gods and strengthen bonds among mortals. At these events, animals were offered to Odin, Thor, or Freyr. Their blood was sometimes sprinkled on the walls or the idols, while the meat was cooked and shared in a communal meal. But don't picture these as somber ceremonies. They were loud, boisterous, emotional. Imagine children running between legs, dogs licking up crumbs, elders clapping along to harp players, and a skald reciting tales of Ragnar's glory as someone accidentally knocks over a jug of mead. In winter, the Yule feast took center stage. This multi-day event marked the turning of the sun and honored the gods of light and fertility. Boar roasted with apples, dried fruits boiled in ale, dense bread with lard, and if possible milk or butter saved from lean months. Everything about Yule was meant to push back the dark, to promise that warmth would return. Some of the foods carried symbolism. Boar represented Freyr, the god of peace and fertility. Eating it was a way to absorb his blessings. Ale was sacred to Odin, so it was often poured in his honor before the first sip. Flatbreads shaped like suns may have been used to symbolize the return of light. Historians still debate whether these symbolic foods had standardized recipes or whether they were regional improvisations with shared meaning. Some archaeologists suggest that what mattered most wasn't the exact ingredients, but the ritual of sharing them together. Feasts weren't just for the gods, though they also had political and legal importance. Major decisions, alliances, property deals, even verdicts were sometimes finalized at feasts. A chieftain might wait until the third horn of mead before offering a gift or making a marriage proposal. This created an emotional atmosphere where the warmth of food softened hard negotiations. And of course, there was competition. Who could eat the most, drink the most, tell the best joke? One light-hearted saga from Iceland tells of a man who won a sheep by eating 20 onions in one sitting, though he spent 3 days in bed afterward. These feasts could last hours or even days, but they also had strict expectations. Guests were expected to bring something: meat, ale, grain, a story, or even just good behavior. Those who overindulged or insulted others risked being uninvited the next time. In one account, a warrior was banished from feasts for constantly stealing leftovers, a serious offense in a culture where food was sacred. And the cleanup? It wasn't glamorous. Bones were tossed into pits, scraps fed to animals, and the next morning began with headaches and cold porridge. But the memory of the meal, the bonds formed, the toasts raised, the stories told, those lasted. Even in death, food followed. Funeral feasts were common, sometimes taking place at the burial mound itself. Mourners might eat roasted meat, drink heavily, and pass a horn around in the dead person's honor. Some graves even included small food offerings: a loaf of bread, a sealed jug of ale, or a salted fish. Oddly, some tombs contain food no longer edible, like grains turned to dust or spoiled meat. Were these simply buried with good intentions, or part of a spiritual belief that the dead would transform them into otherworldly meals? Feasting tied everything together: life, death, love, belief. It wasn't about gluttony. It was about gratitude. In the Viking world, where crops failed and winters bit deep, a feast wasn't just pleasure, it was proof of survival. Each bite was a triumph, each toast a reminder that for now the gods smiled and the hearth burned warm. As you picture that last piece of honeyed meat being passed across the table, Remember the thousands of hands who shaped those moments, the fire-lit faces, the shared laughter, the stories born from bread and meat. So, what does Viking food teach us? More than just what they ate, it shows us who they were. Farmers who worked the soil with calloused hands. Sailors who faced cold seas for fish and salt. Mothers grinding grain at dawn. Children chasing goats through frost-covered fields. Elders carving spoons and saving last year's seeds. Their meals were not extravagant, but they were intentional. Every bite had a cost, in labor, in weather. In time, nothing was wasted. Even a piece of hard cheese or a cup of weak beer held meaning, because it came from effort, from nature, from survival. But there was joy, too, in every warm stew on a winter night, in fresh bread pulled from ash-covered stones, in toasts raised under wooden beams, in simple pleasures shared around a hearth while snow fell outside. Food was connection to gods, to the land, to one another, and surprisingly, parts of that Viking spirit live on today. In Scandinavian smorgasbords with rye bread and smoked fish, in traditions of foraging wild herbs and berries, even in modern Viking reenactments where meals are recreated by firelight, with laughter and mead. It's easy to see Vikings as warriors with swords and ships, but they were also bakers, brewers, and gatherers. Their strength wasn't just in battle, it was in every winter they endured, in every seed they saved, and every table they set. So next time you eat something warm and hearty, something simple but good, remember the Vikings. And if you enjoyed this journey through their kitchens and culture, make sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover, from myth to meal, from battlefield to baking stone. Until next time, stay curious and let history feed your imagination.